Good afternoon. My name is Bernie Kluger, and there's definitely a lot of interesting excitement around the tables as they're coming around. I can see there's a lot of eager conversation and connection and idea generation and hopefully some restaurant recommendations and some other good things going on at the tables. My name is Bernie Kluger. I'm with the Office of Personnel Management, and I've been asked to provide just some brief remarks to introduce our lunch speaker. Kris van Riper joins us from the Corporate Executive Board from their government practice, and she asked me to keep the comments brief. She has a lot to say, and we want to let everyone get back to the networking that you're doing. First of all, she is a native Washingtonian, and she wanted to make sure that if you are looking for those restaurant recommendations or ways to enjoy your time here if you've traveled from out of town, she's available as a resource for that as well. And secondly, that she was actually the original data geek and not Beth Cobert, our director who spoke earlier this morning. Although in this room, I think statistically you might be in the majority here. So with that, I'd like to welcome Kris, who's going to be sharing with you some of her research and perspectives.
So much. Take this down so I can walk around a little bit. Thank you so much. Thank you. Big thank you to Kimya and Stephanie for inviting us to speak at this conference. I'm Kris van Riper. I'm the Managing Director of CB's government practice. I'm very excited to talk to you today about new models of leadership effectiveness. For those of you who don't know CEB, we are a best practices insight and technology company. We work with heads of HR, including CHICOs and heads of learning and development and recruiting, but also many of your peers across the federal government, heads of finance, IT, and communications. We have about 250 government agencies from around the world who work with us, as well as about 90% of the Fortune 500. And that allows us to access a broad network of executives and to create big data sets. Which in speaking to a room of fellow researchers is exciting. And as that, I can assure you that through our conversations with hundreds of executives at both large government agencies and at private sector companies, that this challenge of models of leadership effectiveness is one that we're hearing not just among federal government peers, but across the landscape. And senior leaders at many organizations feeling like the status quo of where they are with leadership effectiveness is not going to lead them to success in the future. And the highlight of our argument is that across our private and public sector members, we're seeing really drastic changes in the complexity of workflows and the complexity of information flows. And that's causing a paradigm shift in the way that we imagine models of leadership, and it's causing HR organizations to rethink their own leadership models. So as we sorted through the consequences of this, we wanted to have a conversation with you to present what we've heard to date and to talk about how it reflects within the context of the federal leadership environment. So across this page, you'll see some concerning statistics. First, that only about 27% of business unit managers feel that their organizations are set up for success in the future based on their leadership teams. On the right, you see a data series of answers to the same question for HR leaders. Asked if given the opportunity, would you swap out members of your senior leadership team? In 2003, that number was only 12%. And in 2013, it's about a third. And that really concerned us. And our initial hypothesis was, well, maybe leaders' competencies have changed over that time period. But you'll see actually that wasn't the case. When we looked at leaders' competencies and their scores of being either effective or very effective, it was about 61% in 2007, about 67% in 2013, so marginally improved. And we were looking at traditional leadership competencies like you see on the right, things like problem solving, resource allocation, agility, team management, things that historically have been able to predict leaders' performance. But what we've seen is although leaders' competencies haven't changed significantly, the leadership environment around them has changed substantially. You can see from the quotes, work is 24/7 now. Many leaders are struggling to keep up with the technologies that their staffs are using. On the bottom right, you can see every day I have to influence someone I've never even met before. And particularly the quote in the bottom left that we hear from federal leaders often, that it's more important than ever to work across organizational lines to deliver on the mission of our organization. And it's not just the silos within our organization, it's silos across the broader government community. And that's a theme that we've also heard from members across departments, and we think about in terms of the president's focus on cross-agency priorities. As many of you know, President Obama has issued cross-agency priority goals, those that have horizontal missions or impact across the government, not just limited to one vertical agency. There are 15 that he announced in the 2015 budget. You can see them across the page. And these are areas of real importance where we won't be able to achieve mission goals through the acts or efficiency of productivity of just one agency. Things like climate change. There's no chance that we'll be able to impact that mission outcome just by the effective performance of EPA by itself or National Science Foundation by itself. Veterans' mental health is a great example, and Tawanda from HUD and I were talking earlier this morning about veterans' homelessness. That's an issue that touches DOD and VA and HUD and many organizations across the federal government. Some of these are mission-oriented. Some of the President's CAP goals are around management effectiveness, specifically cybersecurity. That's a problem across the federal government. It won't be solved just by HR people or just by IT people, but it needs to be a leadership imperative across the government. And so clearly there's increasing demand for this more collaborative leadership model. But overall, we've seen that leaders struggle to break down silos. On the left, you see that only 10% of heads of HR believe that their leaders are effective at creating conditions that facilitate collaboration across teams. Only 38% of heads of HR believe that leaders consider organization-wide needs when making decisions. And many leaders grew up in an environment where their success was based on a myopic focus on what was best for their team within their silo, within their organization, and they weren't necessarily incented to consider the organization-wide needs or impact of their broader decisions and trade-offs. And so the key challenge that our members see in leadership today is really highlighted in the quote on the bottom. Right now, our leaders aren't willing to think outside their own business units, and it's hurting our performance. We need to get leaders thinking about how to have an impact on the broader organization. And that became the focus of our research on this leadership challenge. How do we get leaders to focus on the impact on the broader organization? What does that mean for our model of leadership effectiveness in the future? And we found that one key challenge is that most leaders still primarily focus on their individual goals in their individual business units. Now, we've coined the term individual leadership. That is individual leaders who are highly effective at achieving their own objectives across their own teams. And you see on the right that actually most people are very successful in that. 82% of HR leaders say that their business partners, their leaders, are meeting or exceeding performance expectations as designed in their performance reviews. But unfortunately, that's not leading to enterprise outcomes. And so we've proposed a new model of leadership. And let me start on the right first by saying the area that we're most interested in focusing on is one that allows us to better deliver on enterprise outcomes of performance, not only of your business unit, but across other business units and teams. And as part of that, we've identified 3 components. First, individual leadership. So that's a leader's effectiveness at meeting objectives for his or her own team for individual performance. Network performance. Their effectiveness at both contributing to and leveraging from the performance of other business units or teams. And then the combination of the two, the ability to not only deliver on your goals, but also to impact the broader enterprise. So as we looked at these different components of enterprise leadership, we found a couple of numbers. So on the left, some encouraging numbers. 77% of leaders are effective at individual leadership, of meeting their individual objectives. 59% of leaders were effective at leading his or her teams to effective performance. In the middle, not such encouraging numbers. 31% of leaders are effective at contributing to and leveraging the performance of others. And just 35% of leaders were effective at leading their teams to do the same. And unfortunately, the combination of those, the number of leaders who were very good at both individual performance and network leadership, was only 12%. Now, I knew that I'd be speaking to a group of people that cared very much about the government and not-for-profit sectors. So our team polled what was our result for the industry segment for government and not-for-profit to see if it would be higher or lower than 12%. So let me ask across the room for you to think about it. Do you think the government number would be higher or lower than the average number? Can I have the folks who think it would be higher to stand up and the folks that think it would be lower to stay seated? Okay. I probably could, but in this sample I didn't, because I worried that the size would get too small. Okay, you were right. And let me ask you, why do you think that is the case? Why would government leaders be better than their not-for-profit, than their for-profit peers at thinking about broader goals and not just their individual performance?
Well, one of the folks at the table say because of mission, but for me, it's like there's shared outcomes. We're all here for public service. So there is this desire to focus on how is so-and-so doing and how's this agency doing it, how is that agency? So there's this desire to go out, benchmark, figure out, has somebody cracked that nut already, and is there a way that we can utilize what has already been done so we don't have to recreate the wheel because we're trying to get to outcomes faster as a result?
That's what we hoped too, and I think that's true. The only challenge was when we cut the numbers, it was only 15%. That's the good news, bad news story. And 15% is much better than 12%, but it's still not enough to deliver on some of the cross-agency priorities we were just looking at. And so overall, we wanted to better understand what are some of the costs and benefits of enterprise leadership, and how can we create more enterprise leaders? So here are some of the benefits. And in this room full of people who are very excited about the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey, I'm very excited to say that their employee engagement of teams led by enterprise leaders has a 35% maximum impact lift on their one-year change in employee engagement when we compare them to average performing individual focus leaders. Also, we see higher levels of customer satisfaction. We see about a 20% bump there on customer satisfaction scores. So that was very encouraging to us because we wanted to ensure that enterprise leadership did lead to better team outcomes. Because we work with private sector companies as well, we also have the benefit that private sector companies can give us of having these beautiful, very clear, objective, quantitative outcomes like revenues that we can measure that helps us separate the signal from the noise in our data sets. And we found overall that enterprise leaders also were able to contribute to revenue growth with a 12% lift compared to average performing individual leaders. So that was encouraging in terms of their ability to contribute to team outcomes. And so we wanted to start painting a picture of what organizations would look like. One on the left, where you had an organization that was not led by a group of enterprise leaders, and an alternative organization on the right that was led with enterprise leaders. We looked at our data sets. We found organizations that fit into roughly those two molds, and through a series of interviews also tried to understand what's the impact that enterprise leaders could have across key areas of management. So first, in strategic planning, Organizations that are not led by a group of enterprise leaders can often have conflicting strategies where leaders are presenting options to maximize the performance of their business units, and that can result in conflicts across the organization. On the right, you can see overall that organizations with higher densities of enterprise leaders have the benefit of creating strategies that incorporate strategic needs beyond the performance of each individual business unit. Third down, you see on competition for resources in organizations without enterprise leaders that teams are competing for resources or in some cases hoarding talent. On the right, there's more strategic allocation of resources and talent is viewed as a shared asset. So when I ask folks to look across those two organizations, I see some head nodding. I'm imagining several of you are saying, yep, that's what we have, and yep, that's what we need. But it's not like these traits we haven't been talking about for years. I mean, the cross-agency priorities, I think, are at least 5 years old. And so enterprise leadership at a conceptual level makes sense to us. And we want to understand why our leaders aren't embracing it. And I know Dr. Maya Shankar is speaking later this afternoon. I'm very excited to hear her speak. She will be excited to hear that we think the reason is because of behavioral economics. There are several perceived costs that leaders feel gets in the way as impediments to becoming enterprise leaders. And the first cost on the left is lack of control. If you see that quote, many leaders believe, I can't be successful as a leader without autonomy and control. About 66% of respondents agreed with that statement. And many people unkindly call this group of folks control freaks. We believe and prefer the term control enthusiasts. And this is a group of people, to be fair, who've grown up and all of their leadership experience has led them to believe that having more control and autonomy correlates with their success. You can also see that there's frustration in the middle in terms of incomplete information. Unfortunately, when we ask people, I understand how to productively contribute to the network, only 37% of leaders agreed with that statement. And third, in terms of rewards risk, when we asked, will my contributions to others be financially rewarded, only 35% of leaders agreed with that statement. And so it's beginning to make more sense why, even if they largely have the right competencies, even if conceptually they have the right incentives, why these perceived costs will cause leaders to say that it's not only hard to be an enterprise leader, it's hard to even want to be an enterprise leader. And so organizations that we've worked with that have been successful increasing the number of enterprise leaders have directly gone after these three costs. So the first one is lack of control. We want to move from a state where we're building leadership skills to adjust to having less control, to actually changing mindsets about their roles. And this is going to cause us to think differently about leader development. Second, we see organizations focus on that incomplete information. And rather than creating universal and generic competencies and expectations, we really want to increase transparency into the relative strengths of your peers in different departments across the organization. And this will cause us to rethink leader assessment and role design. And then third, we've seen organizations really focus on rewards risk. We're rewarding leaders for enterprise leadership behaviors, and we really want to make sure that we're also rewarding enterprise leadership outcomes. And that'll cause us to revisit leader rewards. And the good news at the bottom of the page is that organizations that have successfully addressed these three risks have been able to increase the percentage of enterprise leaders by about 4 times, moving from about 12% to about 47%. And one thing that we thought was encouraging is we looked overall at President Obama's executive order on reforming the senior executive service that was announced in December. And we saw actually that many of the reforms that are being proposed go to some of these costs. One of the first ones is shifting a focus to promoting rotations for SES executives across the federal government. It's really hard for people to have the information that they need to know how to contribute and where to leverage knowledge if they've only grown up in one organization inside one silo. So they've now set goals for SES rotation across the federal government. The second is, you can see on the right there now, onboarding goals for new SES employees. And part of onboarding is going to be not only teaching them about their organization and their organization's goals, but also helping them understand how that fits into the broader agency's mission and how that fits into some cross-agency priorities across the federal government. And then third, they've proposed changes for SES leaders in terms of performance-based incentives for some of these enterprise leadership behaviors and outcomes. And we think that's a step in the right direction. So I want to make sure we have some time for Q&A. I also want to make sure that we have some time for discussion at the tables. So let me propose that we spend about 10 minutes going through Q&A that you have, and then I'd love for at each table, for each group to talk about how they feel that these trends are represented in their own teams that they work with. So first, are we accurately communicating future leadership needs and challenges to our organization's leadership? Second, which of the economic costs is making it difficult for our leaders to behave like enterprise leaders? And third, how should I engage with my peers on the executive team to address economic costs of enterprise leadership? And it'll be really interesting. I'll walk around and eavesdrop on some of your conversations, but I'm very interested in how these trends are manifesting in your own organizations, in your own teams, and how you think that they're represented across the federal government context. So let me see if there are any questions. Yes.
What was the period of time from where the percentage increased? You just look back to. What was the period of time that the increase for enterprise leaders was 4 times? Over what period of time, do you know?
We have a pretty clear division of labor on my research team that I can answer the really easy questions, and the hard questions go to Liz and Mara, who also work for CB. This research is from our Corporate Leadership Council, from our Enterprise Leadership Study, which we released last year. And my understanding was that it was over a 12-month time frame. Is that right?
Looking at who has what kind of leadership and what are they doing differently to actually improve the amount of leadership in their organization that distributes or demonstrates enterprise leadership traits, right? So if you're doing all these 3 things in the organizations that are doing these things, we saw the jump to the 47% of people that are sitting in all 4 of those categories. So it wasn't necessarily longitudinal per se. It was organizations that did and did not, and we compared those 2. Does that make sense?
Yeah. That's absolutely true.
Talking about perceptions of HR leaders, that HR leaders know what to say in an organization that says it values enterprise leadership as opposed to others? Well, that you're measuring who are effective enterprise leaders by what? By 360 feedback in an organization that says we're supposed to be doing all these things. And it just seems like it's more likely that there's going to be a bias towards saying our leaders do these things when the organization says that's what leaders should be doing.
Yeah.
One of the classic themes in the public management field is looking at the differences between the public sector and the private sector. So it's very hard to be able to figure out the effect of those differences in the way you've presented this data. I mean, when I listen to this, which is a very interesting depiction, it seems to me that it's very much an argument for minimizing the differences between the public and private sector, number one. And number two, and it's the thing that really bothers me, is I don't think that the person who put this together has taken a look at the Constitution of the U.S. recently.
Well, let me address that. So the research was written for the broader cross-functional membership, cross-industry membership. The purpose of the research was not to compare and contrast management styles between public and private sector. No, well, we look at the numbers and we look at the different industry cuts. But I absolutely recognize, given the membership that we work with, that there are unique constraints that our federal government members are operating under. And there are unique challenges in the way that they're trying to meet their missions. I will argue, just based on having presented this research to lots of federal executives, that the need for cross-enterprise collaboration is increasing in both the private and public sector for different reasons. And so while the solutions will probably be customized to fit within the constraints and context of the government agencies, we hope that some of the solutions could be shared that have been developed in one organization and happen to work, that could then be shared and to a broader audience of people that can use them. Yeah.
How did you define leadership? Did you separate political and career SES or go down to the GS 15-14 level? Because I think there's a big difference between political leadership and career leadership.
Yeah, that came up in the session that we just had with Zachary and Mr. Robinson. And we have been doing a lot of research recently on the topic of administration transitions. And particularly on the changing role of leadership for career employees during a period of substantial leadership uncertainty on the political side, which we have already entered and we expect won't be complete for the next 18 or so months. And that really does change what kind of leadership we ask of our career executives and how to ensure that those basic mission goals that we know won't change across administrations, we can continue to make progress on. Things like cost efficiency and functional maturity. Yeah, let me take this one more question, and then let me ask everyone, we can break into groups to talk about how you see this manifesting across your own experience.
Sure. Kelly Caramelli from Veterans Affairs. Can you speak to the overlap between enterprise? You can't hear them? Can you speak to the overlap between enterprise leadership and maybe servant leadership, which is something that we're working on in VA, and I see many overlapping elements here between developing others to learn, that there are risks in terms of I'm investing more time and effort. So if you could speak to that, that'd be great.
So there have been a couple of really interesting things written about servant leaders and leaders as servants. I think some of the concepts are similar. Let me talk about what I know about servant leadership first and why I think it's especially relevant at VA. Servant leadership said that leaders need to focus on followership, not just leadership, of serving their customers, their employees, and their constituencies, and leading by example, and how to best understand how they can contribute to their different stakeholders as a key source of their leadership authority and authenticity. And I think some of that overlaps in that you need to think about the fact that you have multiple stakeholders and multiple audiences that may not cleanly be represented in your own individual business unit goals. and how do you ensure that across your leadership style you're balancing the need to deliver on your individual outcomes as well as the outcomes of the organization more broadly. Did you want to say something?
Need the resources that they need in order to move through the organization. So as you're thinking about what describes servant leadership, that is part of it, right? So it's about helping them follow you as opposed to pushing them in a direction. And that's very much in line with what we're talking about with enterprise leadership as well, and what actually gets down to the tactics and what this actually looks like. They're very, very similar.
And earlier this morning, we had a presentation on leadership, and Mr. Robinson, who used to work at VA, talked about the VA's values and Secretary McDonald's work to make sure that people are wearing pins with the I Care values and ensuring that the work directly ties to service to veterans. And the pins matter, but what matters more is that everyone is demonstrating those values more broadly across the organization, remembering who they serve. Great. Okay, so with that, we've got about 15 minutes. Is that right? Oh, we've got about 5 minutes. If everyone could introduce yourself to anybody you haven't met at your table, let me turn it back to these 3 questions, and I'd be really interested to get to walk around the room and hear about your own experience and thoughts on how this resonates. Okay. I want to make sure that I'm not stealing time from the presenters that you're going to hear from this afternoon. I want to thank everyone for participation in this session. I hope that through our conversation and through the conversations at your table, you took away some ideas of ways that you're going to think about your own leadership models for effectiveness differently, and ways that you're going to be looking for not just individual leadership, but enterprise leadership in the leaders that you work with. The next set of sessions starts in just a few moments. So thank you so much, and I appreciate your time.
Just one brief comment and announcement before we move on with the afternoon. Kris, thank you so much for your comments today and giving us a lot to think about. On behalf of Director Colbert, who couldn't be with us this afternoon, I do have a gift of